It was one of those Pennsylvania nights when the storm seemed alive. Rain slammed against the stained glass windows of St. Joseph's Church, each drop echoing like a whisper against the silence of the sanctuary. Lightning carved brief flashes of color across the pews, and the great clock above the altar struck midnight. Father Thomas Reed sat alone inside the confessional booth, his rosary wound tight around his fingers. The night had been long, filled with quiet prayers and the faint hum of thunder in the distance. He thought the last penitent had gone home hours ago, until he heard the creak of the wooden door. Footsteps approached, slow, uncertain. Then the sound of the screen sliding open. The priest straightened, his tone gentle, routine. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." But before he could continue, a trembling voice interrupted him. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I think I've already died." The words hung in the air like smoke. Father Thomas froze, unsure he'd heard correctly. The man's voice was hoarse, hollow, almost detached from the world. "My name is Mark," he said after a pause. "Mark Dalton. I shouldn't be here." The priest felt a shiver trace his spine. There was something about the way Mark spoke, each word drawn out, measured, as if he were fighting to stay connected to his own breath. As the confession unfolded, the story turned darker. Mark described being in a car accident earlier that day, on Route 79 just outside Pittsburgh. Paramedics had pronounced him dead at the scene after 10 minutes, without a pulse. But then, somehow, he woke up in the hospital morgue. "The nurse screamed when I sat up," he whispered, voice trembling. "They said I came back." Father Thomas tried to steady his voice. "You were revived?" Mark shook his head, though the priest couldn't see it through the screen. "No, that's the thing. My heart isn't right. It beats wrong. Sometimes it stops altogether." He hesitated. "And I don't feel pain anymore. Not heat, not cold. It's like I'm still somewhere else." The priest could hear the rain intensify, the thunder rolling closer as though the heavens themselves leaned in to listen. Mark continued, his words unraveling like a man trying to confess not a sin, but an existence that defied explanation. He spoke of light, brighter than the sun, surrounding him during those lost 10 minutes. He heard voices calling his name, pulling him back. But one voice, deeper and quieter than the rest, said something he couldn't forget. "You're not done yet." Mark swallowed hard. "But when I woke up, I wasn't alone. Something followed me. I can feel it. It's watching. It doesn't want to let go." Inside the booth, Father Thomas could feel the temperature drop. His breath clouded faintly in the narrow space. He gripped his rosary tighter. He wanted to dismiss it. Shock, trauma, confusion. But something in Mark's tone rooted him in fear. The priest's faith had carried him through wars, funerals, and the confessions of broken souls. Yet nothing prepared him for this. Mark's breathing became shallow. "I thought coming here might help," he said softly. "I thought maybe God could send it back." "But, Father," his voice cracked. "What if it's not from there? What if it's from here?" Before the priest could respond, a violent gust of wind slammed the church doors open. The candles flickered and went out. In the flash of lightning that followed, Father Thomas saw movement, something pale through the narrow gap in the confessional door. He blinked, and it was gone, then silence. A single sound broke it, the confessional door creaking shut. Slowly, Father Thomas opened his side of the booth. The opposite door hung ajar, empty. He stepped into the aisle, heart pounding, rainwater dripping from the eaves above. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The confessional stood still in the darkness, as if nothing had happened. But the words lingered in his ears, chilling and eternal. "I think I've already died." Father Thomas crossed himself, whispering a prayer he hadn't said in years. He didn't yet know that this night, the night of that confession, would mark the beginning of a mystery no scripture could explain. The rain hadn't stopped since that night. By the time dawn crept over Pittsburgh, the city was veiled in fog, and the news cycle was already buzzing with a story that sounded more like urban legend than fact. "A firefighter pronounced dead comes back to life in morgue," read one headline. But behind the sensationalism lay a truth no one could explain, and that truth was Mark Dalton. Mark was 34, a husband, a father of 2, and a respected firefighter with the Allegheny County Fire Department. That afternoon, he'd been on his way home after a long shift when a semi-truck lost control on the slick highway. The collision was brutal. First responders pulled him from the wreckage, broken and lifeless. At 4:12 p.m., after multiple attempts to restart his heart, paramedics pronounced him dead. His body was transported to the hospital morgue, tagged and logged. That should have been the end. But 13 minutes later, a nurse named Jenna Miller entered the morgue to complete the final paperwork. She noticed condensation on the inside of the body bag. Thinking it was a trick of the light, she leaned closer and froze. The chest beneath the sheet moved, once, twice. Then a sharp inhale shattered the silence. Jenna screamed for help, and within seconds, the morgue erupted in chaos. Doctors stormed in, thinking it was a reflex, some remnant of nerve activity. But the monitor told a different story, a faint, steady rhythm. Mark Dalton was breathing again. Dr. Evelyn Harper, the attending physician, later described it as a spontaneous return of circulation, a phenomenon so rare it's documented in less than 0.005% of cardiac deaths. It's called Lazarus syndrome, she explained to reporters. Sometimes after failed resuscitation, the heart restarts on its own, but not after 10 minutes. Not like this. Yet what disturbed staff the most wasn't that he woke up. It was how he woke up. His skin was icy cold to the touch, his pupils sluggish and unreactive to light. He didn't shiver, didn't ask for warmth. Instead, he sat up and calmly asked, "Where's my family?" The nurse said his voice carried no panic, just confusion. He looked alive, she said later. But not completely. Mark underwent full-body scans, blood tests, and neurological evaluations. Everything looked normal. No sign of oxygen deprivation, no brain damage, no cardiac anomaly. His heart, however, maintained an irregular rhythm. Too slow, too steady, like it was beating from somewhere outside the usual rhythm of life. When discharged the next day, doctors called it a medical miracle. But as Mark walked out of that hospital, he kept his gaze down, his hand pressed to his chest, murmuring a prayer only he could hear. That evening, as he lay in bed beside his wife Laura, she noticed something strange. His skin was still cold, unnaturally so, and when she touched his wrist, his pulse fluttered, then paused altogether. "Are you okay?" she whispered. He didn't answer right away. Then, in a distant tone, he said, "I think something came back with me." By the time night fell again, the air over the small town of Millvale was heavy with fog, the kind that seemed to swallow sound and make every shadow stretch longer than it should. Father Thomas Reed sat alone in the rectory office of St. Joseph's Church, finishing his evening prayers. The church was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the steady hum of rain against the stained glass. He was about to lock up when the doors creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Mark Dalton. The priest recognized him immediately, not from his parish, but from the news reports that had dominated local channels all day. The man who came back from the dead, they called him. Mark looked different in person. His clothes were damp, his eyes distant, unfocused. He walked with an odd stiffness, like someone not entirely sure of how to move through space. When Father Thomas asked if he was all right, Mark simply replied, "I need to confess." Inside the confessional booth, the light was dim, flickering softly behind the wooden lattice. The priest's voice carried steady compassion, honed through decades of listening to human sorrow. "What troubles you, my son?" Mark's voice trembled as he began. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I think I brought something back with me." The priest paused, uncertain if he'd heard correctly. Mark continued, his words broken, almost frantic. He described moments since his resurrection that defied all sense. How his reflection seemed delayed in mirrors. How his breath sometimes fogged glass hours after the room had warmed. How his heart monitor at home occasionally flatlined before beating again on its own. He said he could no longer feel pain. He'd burned his hand on a stove that morning and felt nothing. "It's like my body's alive," he said, "but something inside me isn't." Father Thomas tried to steady his voice, urging calm, suggesting medical evaluation, but Mark's next words froze the air between them. "When I was gone, I saw them, faces, voices calling my name. But something else was there too. It followed me back." A long silence followed. The priest could hear the faint tremor of rain against the roof, the faint rasp of Mark's uneven breathing. Then came a whisper, so soft Father Thomas almost missed it. "Sometimes I stop breathing. My heart stops. I can feel it. But then it starts again." The priest, moved by instinct rather than reason, lifted the screen separating them. On the other side, Mark sat motionless. His skin was waxy pale, his eyes fixed, but glinting faintly, as though reflecting light that wasn't there. "Father," he murmured, "I don't think I'm supposed to be here." Then, without warning, Mark's body convulsed. A violent shudder ripped through him. His breathing ceased. The flickering bulb above dimmed, then surged bright white before bursting with a soft pop. Father Thomas leapt from his seat, pushing open the confessional door. But when he reached for Mark, the seat was empty. The door to the confessional creaked shut behind him, slow and deliberate, though no one was there to move it. The priest stood frozen, staring at the vacant booth. His pulse thundered in his ears. Somewhere in the silence, a faint exhale brushed the back of his neck. Morning light filtered weakly through the rain-streaked windows of St. Joseph's Church. Father Thomas sat motionless in his office, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. His hands trembled as he replayed the memory. The sound of Mark's whisper, the flicker of the light, and that impossible emptiness when he opened the booth. He had called the police, of course. They'd searched the church from the nave to the cellar, but there was no trace of Mark Dalton. No footprints on the wet floor, no sign of forced entry or exit. The officers exchanged uneasy glances when he explained what happened. "You're saying the man just vanished?" one asked, pen hovering over his notepad. Father Thomas couldn't answer. By mid-morning, the news broke that Mark's family had reported him missing. His wife, Laura Dalton, said he'd left the house around 10 the previous night, saying he needed to talk to someone. He never came home. The last call from his phone pinged near St. Joseph's. The investigation quickly turned clinical, procedural. Detectives interviewing neighbors, canvassing the area, pulling traffic cam footage. But the priest knew what he saw, or rather what he didn't see. And the absence of reason gnawed at him. That evening, unable to rest, Father Thomas sought out someone who might offer more grounded answers. He drove to Mercy General Hospital, where Mark had been treated after his supposed death. Dr. Evelyn Harper, a neurologist known for her studies on near-death experiences, greeted him with quiet curiosity. Her office smelled of antiseptic and coffee, a blend of faith and fatigue. She listened patiently as the priest described everything, her face unreadable. When he finished, she spoke softly. There's a phenomenon called Lazarus syndrome, spontaneous return of circulation after failed resuscitation. It's rare, but it happens. Sometimes gas builds in the chest cavity, and when it releases, it can mimic breathing. But he walked out of the hospital. The priest interrupted, his tone sharpening. He spoke. He confessed. Dr. Harper hesitated. Then that's not Lazarus syndrome. That's something else entirely. She explained that, under extreme conditions, the brain can retain residual electrical activity after clinical death. But for someone to remain conscious, mobile, aware, hours later, was beyond medicine. If what you're describing is accurate, she admitted, then we're talking about a biological impossibility. Father Thomas sat in silence, the rain tapping faintly against the hospital window. He wanted to believe science could explain what he witnessed. He wanted the world to remain orderly, rational. But deep down, he felt the chill of something older, something unseen pressing against the edges of understanding. That night, he returned to the church. The building felt different now, hollow yet watchful. As he walked past the confessional, he heard it again, a faint rhythmic sound just beneath the hum of the lights. Breathing. He froze, heart pounding. Slowly, he opened the booth door. The seat was empty, but the air inside was colder than ice. He whispered to the darkness, "Mark." The only reply was a soft, drawn-out sigh, the sound of someone exhaling in the dark. The following days unfolded like fragments of a waking dream. The church stood as it always had, humble brick, candlelight flickering beneath vaulted arches. But Father Thomas felt something unnatural pressing against the silence. Parishioners began whispering about strange things happening during evening mass. Candles that refused to stay lit, crucifixes swaying gently even when there was no wind. And a chill, not the kind that came from a draft, but a creeping cold that seemed to settle inside the bones. At first, Father Thomas dismissed it as nerves, his mind searching for patterns in grief. But the signs grew harder to ignore. One morning, while preparing the altar, he noticed faint handprints smeared on the inside of the confessional glass, human-sized, smudged, and cold to the touch. He scrubbed them clean, whispered a prayer, and yet the next day, they were back. Each night, he told himself he would not return to the confessional after hours. Each night he did, the fear turned to obsession. He began recording his nightly rounds, setting an old voice recorder on the pew nearest the booth. For 3 nights, there was nothing but silence, the faint hiss of static and the soft echo of his footsteps. But on the 4th night, something changed. A faint voice broke through the static. Weak, distant, unmistakably human. "It wasn't my time," it whispered. Father Thomas dropped the recorder in shock. His hands trembled as he played it back again and again. The voice, its tone, its breath, was identical to Mark Dalton's. He could hear the faint rasp in every syllable, like a man speaking from somewhere far beyond the world of the living. The next morning, he drove to see Laura Dalton. Her eyes were hollow from sleeplessness, her movements mechanical. She confessed that she too had been hearing things. "The phone rings at night," she said softly. "When I answer, no one speaks. But last night," she hesitated, clutching her cross necklace. "Last night, there was breathing. Slow, steady, like someone standing right beside me." The priest's composure faltered. He asked to hear it for himself. She retrieved her phone, played back the voicemail that had arrived just after midnight. The sound was unmistakable, a single exhale, long and uneven, like a man taking his first breath after drowning. Neither spoke for a long while. Outside, wind rattled the windows. When Father Thomas finally stood to leave, Laura whispered, "Do you think he's still here?" He wanted to say no. He wanted to tell her it was just a glitch, a cruel trick of coincidence. But as he stepped outside into the pale winter sunlight, his breath caught. On his car window, written faintly in condensation, were 2 words scrawled by an unseen hand. "Forgive me." Father Thomas had always believed that faith and reason could coexist, that science explained the body, while faith spoke to the soul. But now, that line had vanished, blurred into something he could neither define nor escape. The church, once a sanctuary, had become a place of unease. Every creak of the pew, every flicker of candlelight felt like a whisper from something unseen. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it carried dreams filled with muffled breathing and the echo of Mark Dalton's trembling voice. "I think I've already died." Desperate for understanding, Father Thomas sought help beyond the church walls. His first visit was to Dr. Evelyn Harper, the neurologist he had spoken with before, a woman of science, skeptical yet kind. She greeted him in her sterile office, where the hum of fluorescent lights replaced the church's quiet reverence. He told her everything, the handprints, the recordings, the whispers. Dr. Harper listened carefully, her expression caught between pity and intrigue. Certain patients who experience clinical death, she said, sometimes describe seeing or hearing things as their brain shuts down. But what you're describing, that persistence, that awareness, it defies everything we know about cellular death. Her explanation brought no comfort. If anything, it deepened the mystery. Are you saying, Father Thomas asked, that what I saw couldn't have happened? She hesitated. I'm saying it shouldn't have. Later that evening, he met with Father McClellan, an older priest, known for his quiet work with cases the church never spoke of publicly. The two men sat across from each other in the darkened rectory, a single candle burning between them. McClellan's gaze was heavy. You're not the first priest to see something that doesn't fit doctrine, he said. There are moments when the soul doesn't realize it's gone. It lingers, confused, unfinished, and sometimes something else takes its place. Father Thomas's heart pounded. You think this is possession? He asked. McClellan shook his head slowly. Not possession, confusion. Some souls, Father don't know they've crossed. They agreed to return to the church together just before midnight to pray and observe. The air that night was thick and cold, the kind that numbs the skin and slows the breath. The two priests stepped into the sanctuary, their footsteps echoing against the stone floor. The confessional sat waiting, silent, ordinary, and yet alive with dread. As they approached, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath fogged the air. The candles on the altar flickered, then extinguished one by one. And then, from behind the confessional screen came a single word, drawn out, faint but unmistakable. Father? McClellan began the prayer of deliverance, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. Father Thomas joined in, his own words quivering as he felt something shift. Not in the air, but inside him. The sound in the room changed, deepened, pulsing low like a distant heartbeat. The candle flame stretched tall and thin, and then silence. The lights flickered once, twice, then everything stopped. No sound, no breath. Just the heavy electric quiet of something unseen retreating or waiting. When it was over, McClellan turned to him, his face pale. You asked for reason, he whispered. But tonight, you found faith. Days passed, but Father Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the church. The confessional stood empty, yet every time he walked past it, he felt a pulse, faint, rhythmic, almost human. Parishioners began avoiding the booth altogether. They whispered of cold drafts, of strange shadows behind the lattice screen, of voices murmuring long after midnight. The building had grown restless, and so had his soul. On the seventh night after that final prayer, Father Thomas returned alone. The church was dark except for the faint light of the moon spilling through the stained glass, painting streaks of crimson and gold across the floor. He carried only a small recorder, the same one that had captured Mark Dalton's last words. He set it gently on the confessional's ledge, pressed record, and whispered, If you're still here, speak. For a long time there was nothing but silence. Then the recorder clicked faintly, static, a breath. And through that haze of noise came a whisper. Strained, fragmented, unmistakably human. I never finished confessing. His chest tightened. Mark, he said, voice trembling. You're forgiven. Go in peace. But the air grew colder. The whisper came again, this time closer. Not me? That moment froze him where he stood. The shape that emerged wasn't visible, but it could be felt. A presence pressing against the boundaries of space itself. The confessional door creaked open by its own weight, releasing a slow, hollow groan. Father Thomas clutched his rosary, the beads trembling in his hand as he prayed aloud, but the prayer felt small, swallowed by something far larger than faith or fear. And then came the realization that chilled him deeper than anything before. The voice wasn't coming from the booth. It was coming through it. The recorder shook slightly, the static surging like a heartbeat. And within that chaos came words he would never forget. He's still waiting to be heard. Father Thomas left the church before dawn, his mind split between the logic of his vows and the impossible truth he had witnessed. He never returned to that confessional again. Parish records show he transferred to a quieter parish up north, though no one could say why. But every few weeks, someone from his old congregation claimed to hear the sound of murmured voices in the church after hours. Faint, steady, like someone whispering their sins into an empty booth. Years later, when a new priest arrived, he found an old recorder locked away in the rectory drawer. Out of curiosity, he played it. The tape was mostly blank, just the hum of ambient noise. Until the final seconds. There, beneath the static, a calm, familiar voice said, Father Thomas, are you still listening? The tape clicks off. The sound ends. And for those who hear it, silence feels heavier than sound itself. A silence that carries confession, faith, and something neither could ever explain. Because some voices, its seams are never meant to fade.